of years. So I invite all of you here watching and listening to really explore those synergies and see what resonates within our own context, and I'm sure you will find plenty. So now I'm very pleased to introduce and then hand over to our guest. Dr. Elena Aydarova is an Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a Fellow with the National Education Policy Center. Her interdisciplinary research lies at the intersections of educational policy, anthropology, and comparative and international education. Dr. Aydarova examines the influence of educational policies on equity, social justice, and often through the unique lens of theatre. She is an award-winning author of over 40 publications, including the acclaimed book, Teacher Education Reform as Political Theatre, Russian Policy Dramas. Dr. Aydarova, over to you.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for such a generous introduction and just for the opportunity to be in community with you all. It is a tremendous honor and pleasure for me. Before I start, I want to say I'm joining you from the traditional lands of Ho-Chunk people who were forcibly and violently removed from these lands, who experienced acts of violence and genocide from the hands of settlers, who are fighting for sovereignty and recognition and for the continuation of their language and culture. And I stand in solidarity with their struggle. I am going to share my presentation now, and as I am opening up my slides, I want to make sure that I tell you that I am a comparativist by training, and so I do a lot of international research, and I'm very conscious of the fact that things can happen very differently around the world. However, for the past 5 years, the research that I have been doing on the science of reading have been US based. So you'll hear a lot of American goes, a lot of elements of political institutions and structures from the US. But partly what's important to understand is there are global networks that connect these different actors. And so even though some of those things may seem strange, you will see how there is a power grab happening that is spreading around the world. I will have a talk that will have several parts. I'll briefly set the context. Primarily, I'll focus on the science of reading as a curriculum reform. I'll talk a little bit about policy networks that mobilize it, and then I'll conclude with a conversation about the privatization of instructional core. On some slides, I'm including the QR code and a short link. If you're ever interested in telling me about your own experiences or about what you are going through, I'd love to hear from you. So when you see the link and the QR code, it's not so much the presentation, but it's more what are you going through wherever you are. All right, so moving on. So first, for context, in the United States, I actually taught literacy courses 15 years ago, and we had a fairly peaceful life. We talked about, using assessment data to inform instruction, to differentiate, to meet the needs of our students. And we talked about phonics and other things. And then all of a sudden, in 2017, 2018, education journalist Emily Hanford started putting out podcasts that started talking about the literacy crisis in the United States, how two-thirds of children are not reading at the grade level, or a third of children are reading below basics, and then other ones are not achieving as they should. And the reason why this is happening is because teachers are not using science of reading, and they're not using the science of reading because colleges of education are not teaching the science of reading where they are. And this was followed later by a podcast that is called Sold a Story that had multiple parts that then attacked the folks who have done work that was much more about child-centered literacy approaches, child study, really understanding how children approach reading and so on. And Hanford made an argument that all of that was not science, and really criminal activity that was all about profits. So that has led to a set of changes that have been happening very rapidly here in the US, but also internationally. And Hanford came to visit New Zealand in 2023. She actually was invited to present and talk about her podcast and about the things that she has been uncovering through her journalism. So again, an American who is traveling around the world telling others how they should be doing things. What this reporting I will say led to for now, but I will kind of qualify this later, is a massive set of changes. And many of our bills across the United States have key components about curricula, about assessments, about reading plans, about notifying parents if children are failing, making sure that there's professional development for teachers in the science of reading, and then requiring new licensure tests for teachers. But this is not all. There's much more with requirements for coaching support, with demands of high quality instructional materials, academic transparency, using decodable books, high dosage tutoring, summer camps, interventions for struggling readers, third grade retention. And it's just a juggernaut of reform because this is not even touching all the things that are now being asked of teachers in conjunction with the science of reading reforms. Before I move on, it's important to address the definitions, and I just want to make sure that we are on the same page. I'm going to be talking about how things are being discussed in policy contexts. So what is the science of reading? Well, Emily Hanford, the journalist that I just mentioned to you, uses the definition she found on the blog of a cognitive psychologist, Mark Seidenberg. And she says, well, there's some basic research that has been done in psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, and so on. Two groups that have been very influential in the United States. I'll talk more about Excel and Ed, but another one is National Council on Teacher Quality. They just say science of reading is phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary fluency, and comprehension. And again, I've taught literacy courses at the university level. These were all things that we always covered. And so when I saw these definitions and the explanation of how these are the things that are actually missing from instruction, I was deeply surprised, particularly because also this all came from a 2000 report by the National Reading Panel, which is now 25 years old. International Dyslexia Association speaks of science of reading as scientific evidence that informs structured literacy. And from what I could gather, conversations in New Zealand rotate a lot more about this conversation about structured literacy, explicit, direct instruction. Again, this is all tied to the organizations that are influential in policy spaces. However, there's one activist who's been going around really pushing for science of reading around the United States in particular. But in one of the podcasts, he said, you know, I don't care what you call it, just do something, right? Whatever you want to call it, this all works for us. And this is really important, right? Because this conceptual vagueness about what it actually is allows the science of reading to become many different things in policy contexts. So for this reason, what I have arrived at is that, and I have to say, there are colleagues in the field who are also beginning to think about this in this way, that yes, there is indeed a knowledge base in neuroscience and cognitive psychology. There is a scientific society for the science of reading. There's a journal that comes out. But what happens in policy and educational reforms in the United States and around the world has less to do with those societies. Even though people from those groups sometimes feel very proud that, you know, finally they're being listened to. My findings is that actually science of reading is much more an ideologically driven reform. that is led by conservative think tanks, nonprofits, curriculum publishers, ed tech companies, philanthropic donors, and venture philanthropy. And I talk about this as science of reading with capital letters, right? To distinguish this as a corporate movement that is really rewriting what is happening in schools and what is happening between students and teachers. And I also want to highlight right away that it is not just about profit. This is actually a much bigger project that is about social and cultural change. And I want you to pay attention to that as I keep going through the findings of the 5-year study that I've been engaging in. You might have seen the Scarborough Rope, the simple view of reading. I've stolen it a little bit and modified it to capture how science of reading reforms or structured literacy reforms have a lot of threads tangled up in them, and those include curriculum reform, centralization and standardization of decision making, deregulation of teacher preparation, as well as privatization of instructional core. I won't be able to talk about all of those things. I'll highlight some, I'll allude to some, but it is a complex process that, again, is not simply about phonics or changing how teachers do basic things in the classroom. All right. So first, the curriculum reform, and I have to credit Linda for helping me see this important connection. But Core Knowledge Foundation, based in the United States, that was created by E.D. Hirsch, and you see him sitting on stage right here, has an annual conference. And in 2025, they had a conference in Orlando, Florida, where they invited policymakers and decision makers from England, Ireland, and New Zealand, where they invited them to share what they're doing in terms of educational reforms, and particularly what they're doing about reading. And Erica Stanford shared how she has embarked on a dramatic transformation of what's happening in schools in New Zealand after she read the book by E.D. Hirsch. And she is now mandating structural literacy in every classroom, and she has a 6-point plan. And she described how it is Hirsch's work that became blueprint for the reform that she introduced. So, who is E.D. Hirsch? I don't know how many of you have ever had a chance to encounter his work, but he is actually a former professor of English. And again, I want you to hear this. He's not a psychologist, he's not a neuroscientist, he's a professor of English who used to teach at the University of Virginia, who became very famous in 1986, 1987, when he published a book called Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know. And in that book, he made an argument. He said, we have a crisis in education. We have college students arriving on our campuses who don't know basic things. And this is all happening because of progressive and child-centered education. There's no direct instruction. This is creating knowledge deficit. And the way to address that knowledge deficit is to make sure that everybody knows the things that he has included on his list. And if you don't see, I'm holding up Cultural Literacy book that he published. So he created a list of all the things that every American should know as this kind of shared knowledge that then would sustain democracy. Of course, as you can imagine, that book created quite a bit of conflict. And the reason why that created conflict is because anytime you make a list and say this is what everybody should know, you're going to run into problems of some knowledge is being omitted. So he was immediately criticized for a very white supremacist list, frankly. So he says, everybody needs to know the history of Greek civilization and Roman civilization. But for example, his list does not include most of the First Nations who were living on these lands before the settlers came. So he was criticized for this work, but despite this criticism, he continued on and actually made lists that should inform the curriculum and eventually developed it into core knowledge sequence. And I'll talk more about core knowledge language arts. But in addition to this, he made an argument and he said, multicultural education, social justice, this is all misguided. And this is another reason why we're having problems in education, because all of these initiatives are teaching children that they're victims. And instead of telling them that they can overcome any challenges, it is telling them that they can rely on the government or be upset about what the government is doing. So that's the argument he made. Again, a lot of critiques about it. But with identifying problems this way, he said the United States needs to have a national curriculum. He supported the introduction of the Common Core State Standards here in this country, and he made an argument, and this is the argument in the book that the Minister of Education of New Zealand really enjoyed. And the argument is that everybody should have the same curriculum, everybody should have the same knowledge, there should be standardized tests, and grade by grade accountability to ensure that children are learning the content that they are being taught. So from these arguments, he developed a curriculum that became known as Core Knowledge Language Arts. And what's important about this curriculum is that it's focused on direct instruction, and it is highly scripted. You'll hear the language of scope and sequence and ensuring that the curriculum is cumulative. So there has to be a very tight sequencing of topics, and they have to go from easier to more complex. But the argument continues being that it has to be common curriculum that everybody is following to ensure that everybody has the same knowledge, access to the same things, to cultivate patriotism as well as God allegiance. This curriculum has been acquired for distribution by Amplify. So Core Knowledge Language Arts is still run by Core Knowledge Foundation, but Amplify now has the rights to distribute it. I'm going to invite you to think with me for a second. So this is a sample from the first grade, I think it is first grade workbook. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to read. And if you want to put in the chat, maybe what you're noticing about what might be happening in these exercises. Yes, she does say this very frequently. Very sexist, very simple, right? Very basic, yes, sure, you can say that this is, you know, patterns and there's a sequence and it's relying on the decoding skills that students have to develop. But yeah, that's exactly right. This is not from the 50s. This is part of the curriculum that is currently being mandated across this country. Now, I will say there's been some fights. Not all states have adopted it, but the last count that I have done, about 25 states now recommend that this is something that districts should be using in their classrooms. And yeah, regressing is actually a perfect word for it. Core Knowledge Language Arts is not the only curriculum that is being mandated under the Science of Reading bills. There are other texts and other curricula, but they're all labeled as high quality instructional material. So very few options. And they're all labeled the same way, but they all have the same problems. And so I've had teachers from another state reach out to me and share with me how concerned they are about the messages that are overtly racist, overtly justifying the settler colonial project, spreading stereotypes that are very problematic against other racial and ethnic groups, curricula that do not include the voices of the actual groups that are being represented. It is white authors writing about others, with very problematic portrayals. So this is where we're at, right? The conversation in public is about the science of reading, yet what is being introduced is really white supremacist texts that are required for the schools and districts to follow. There's been some academic analysis done of those texts, and they all kind of come to the same place that there is an erasure of indigenous groups, of people of color, and really problematic portrayals of various groups that are non-dominant in the society. Now, Hirsch is not alone, and he has disciples who promote his work, and one of them is Robert Pandisio. He is currently a fellow with American Enterprise Institute, one of the conservative think tanks based in Washington, D.C. And in fact, the video of that panel with the Minister of Education was made available through American Enterprise Institute. They're very proud of their ability to influence what's happening both in the United States and around the world. But Pandisio talks about Emily Hanford, and he says, she has done something, but really she's not saying anything new. This is what we have been working on for the last 20 years. Well, so who is we, right? And I mentioned already he's currently a fellow with American Enterprise Institute. And that organization is connected with a set of other very conservative libertarian organizations. And you might have heard many of the very problematic bills and executive orders that are currently coming out of the White House are informed by the work of the Heritage Foundation. Well, the Heritage Foundation is informing many of the authoritarian and anti-democratic measures that are being introduced across the country. And they're also enthusiastic supporters of E.D. Hirsch and the science of reading movement, right? So this is the outcome of the work of many conservative groups that have been working this for 20 years. Bandicio does something else, though. He doesn't just identify this as a long ball game of the conservative groups. He also says, this moment that the science of reading creates gives us an opportunity not just to introduce common curriculum, and I appreciate your comments about how this is regressing, but also make sure that there are assessments tied to this, that teachers are trained in this, that licensure is tied to teachers implementing that particular curriculum, and so on. So he calls this a virtuous circle, really tightening the screws and controlling what teachers do and what schools do around very specific conservative content. And kind of an offshoot of all of this is also, if you remember, I mentioned Hirsch is a strong believer in standardized tests, and he's really pushing for increasing the number of standardized tests. And now what we see happening in the United States with the introductions of science of reading bills is massive amounts of standardized assessments. Students starting from kindergarten have to have a diagnostic assessment at the beginning of the year, and then 3 screening assessments throughout the year, and that's for reading alone. The new war is math, and there's a push to introduce additional assessment in math as well. So that is a part of this bigger, grander vision of transforming what's happening in schools. Bandicio recently spoke to school board members, right? And they're a governing body that make decisions about districts and what districts should be doing. And for a very long time, those were sleepy meetings that no one really cared about. And with the involvement on conservative groups, these are now fiery sites of culture wars, and Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty is a libertarian think tank, a part of this conservative movement that has been training school boards how to advance conservative agenda. So they invited Pandisio to talk to the school board members, and in that talk, Pandisio brought up, again, core knowledge, language, arts, but he called on school board members to actually go and visit the classrooms and check that everything is followed to a T, and ensure that teachers are posting lessons and all of their materials ahead of time so that parents and community members and conservative activists can check what is happening, and really complain or attack teachers if they're not following all of this to a T. And I'll just quickly respond to Melanie. Math is on the list as well, yes, and your Minister of Education is also talking about math. But in the United States, it's social studies as well. That's going to be the next big war because they've already drafted the standards that they want to see, and those are really, really scary. So before I move on, I just want to highlight that what you see happening is not just, what's happening in the brain, and really none of the things that actually are playing out in policy contexts are about the brain, despite the talk, on podcasts or, what politicians say. It really is about white supremacy, patriotism, very traditional gender norms, opposition to justice, equity, diversity, any form of progressive education. But ultimately, this is also about deprofessionalization, surveillance, and control of teachers, right? That it is about making sure that teachers doing only what they're allowed to do by conservative groups. And there's whole systems of surveillance and reporting that are being set up where parents and community groups can report them to higher authorities for deviating from the plan. And the same conservative groups, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty in particular, supports parents in their lawsuits against schools and against school districts if they find any form of deviation from what they have set out as their agenda. I'll move on because an additional dimension to all of this, apart from a really troubling trend in the types of values and the type of going back to the times when people didn't have rights, it's important to also understand the interconnectedness of the actors that are mobilizing this, because even though Edie Hirsch has a vision and a message that resonates, there are other groups who are pushing this forward. And I want to bring you again to the United States. In 2022, in November, just a month after Emily Hanford released her podcast, Sold a Story, she was a keynote speaker at the Foundation for Excellence in Education annual summit. And you've already heard me say it's an attack on folks who have done great work in thinking about how children learn to read. A year later, the CEO of Excel in Ed opened the summit by celebrating how much impact the organization has had. In just 1 year, multiple states banned the practice of 3Qing. And United States is a large country, it's very decentralized. So this type of fast-pacing change requires enormous amount of coordination, an enormous amount of resources. And Foundation for Excellence in Education creates that space to create that type of change. It's a nonprofit. They define themselves as a policy think tank. They also have a lobbying arm. They were started by Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida, and they receive extensive amounts of funding. And it is massive foundations. Walton family is one of the richest families in the world, but they're also the proponents of very conservative causes. Charles Koch, a billionaire who has built his fortune on petroleum products, he supports their work, but it's also corporate and business actors, right? So you've already heard Amplify. They have the rights to distribute core knowledge, language, arts. They support Excel in Ed summits, as well as other groups, like, for example, Lexia, and I'll return to them in a minute. Foundation for Excellence in Education has been in existence for close to 20 years, and they've offered a playbook. Science of reading is one of the things that they have been actively involved in, but they also promote vouchers for private schools, support for charter schools, support for alternative routes into teaching, right? Teachers don't need to receive professional education. They can just get 5 weeks of training with Teach for America or Teach for All, and be thrown into the classroom and they'll be ready. That's the argument that Excel in Ed makes. And their new turn is support for digital education. So the promotion of platforms and the use of platforms in schools. And the way they spread their ideas is through model bills. They actually give politicians, decision makers, scripts of what they can introduce in their legislature, and then they work with them to modify those scripts so that they fit what the context requires. So their science of reading bill calls for screening and monitoring assessments, professional development, coaching, changes in teacher preparation programs, high quality instructional materials that I've already described to you, as well as retention of children who are not meeting grade level standards. And they always modify those bills. And what happens is when they have those model policies, they bring decision makers for their summits. The decision makers are interacting with for-profits and nonprofits, and they're getting those model bills as things to introduce in their states when they return back home. I want to highlight this. This is from a 2019 summit, but the pattern is generally the same. There are very few academics here. And in fact, that year there was a psychologist. This is actually somebody who is based in New York University, Jonathan Hart, who actually promoted the ban of cell phones in schools. So if you are also experiencing the moment where your ministry is saying all digital devices should be banned, children should not have cell phones or anything else in schools, this is also coming from this organization. So whether you agree with it or not, that reform has also very quickly traveled around the world, but it was initiated here. Now, the summit is interesting because it also brings in representatives of major foundations. And I don't have the time to go into details on this, but Science of Reading is a massive movement that is being funded by very rich groups. And they're funding these reforms not only in the United States, but also around the world. So Gates Foundation has been pushing for Science of Reading reforms in India and in other contexts. And they show up and they participate. They're not just funders, they're actually involved in conversations, they are involved in discussions, they are speaking directly to decision makers. And it is for profits, right? So the companies that are actually offering science of reading products and platforms are also attending these summits. They have information sessions where they can pitch their products and pitch their services, and they're speaking directly to decision makers. It is not just US-based audience. Andrea Schleicher, Director for Education and Skills at OECD, he quite regularly actually comes to ExcelenEd and he shares the trends in international assessments, but also gets to participate in conversations about what should be happening around the world in terms of educational policy. And of course, the OECD plays quite a bit of a role in agenda setting around the world. So he is plugged into these meetings. Now, ExcelenEd is connected to an organization that's called ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. They're a partner with it. And democracy defending groups, watchdogs, describe ALEC as a corporate bill mill. This is a shadow organization funded by billionaires that brings together legislators, gives them bills similar to model bills that ExcelenEd does, and gets them to spread those bills around the states. ALEC has an education task force. ExcelenEd is a member, but they also have the conservative and libertarian think tanks in the country. They're connected to State Policy Network that brings together 68 conservative and libertarian think tanks in this country, including actually there's 4 that are based in Wisconsin. And if you have heard anything on the news about book bans, about the attacks on trans students, the bills that are banning trans athletes from participating in sports based on how they identify. If you have heard anything about critical race theory, attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, these are all the groups that are involved in promoting those. These are also the groups that are very excited about science of reading and push local state level officials to introduce science of reading reforms. In Wisconsin, this group lobbied for this reform. This group promoted it through reports and through their media and through through litigation. There's also private sector actors. So these are two companies that were involved with ALEC from the records that we have. And they're also the ones that are being included in the list of providers who have high quality instructional materials for implementing science of reading. And I've done all of this, not because I want to scare you about everything that's happening in the United States, but because State Policy Network, American Legislative Exchange Council, with whom illuminate is working, are connected to Atlas Network. And Atlas Network is a global network, 500 neoliberal, libertarian, conservative think tanks that are exceedingly influential in public policy, who are promoting pro-business, anti-union, and really anti-democracy agenda around the world. They are involved in education policy, and just going back, New Zealand, the four that I was able to identify as members are those, but the New Zealand Initiative and Maxim Institute have been the two organizations that have been most supportive of the reforms that are being currently promoted by the government. So they like structured literacy. And I hope by now you see why they would find that agenda appealing. I don't have access to Atlas meetings. They're secretive. All of these organizations are very secretive. They limit access to who can get to them, but their member State Policy Network, the conversations there are about eradicating left-leaning radicalism, making sure that children receive the same curriculum. And the point is to make sure the teachers only teach the curriculum so that they won't have time to do anything else, right? And this virtuous circle is what's being promoted there as a way to kind of tighten the screws and control teachers and schools through these reforms. So the key takeaway from this section is that the people who are actually most influential in the policy context are not neuroscientists or cognitive psychologists. It is libertarian, conservative, neoliberal think tanks, massive resources. They're putting out research reports that are research. Very similar narratives repeated across the world. They control media nonprofits that then push podcasts, op-eds, and then they train politicians and lobby for change. But it is more just reform. They actually want to make sure that they're influencing how people think because they want people to accept the ideology of free market and individual responsibility and inequality as givens, right? So I'll close with the final section in ways in which, if it's not scientists, then who is doing this? So it's, yes, the conservative think tanks, but also it is businesses, for profits, and corporations. And again, I've mentioned American Legislative Exchange Council has the conservative think tanks as members that are developing these policies and pushing them through. But among them are also for-profit entities. And what you see, for example, here is an example. Metametrics is an organization that has representatives come to Ed summits, and they talk about how their assessments came from research and now became a product, and they use this language of comparing their scale to Fahrenheit and Celsius, right? So a very performative use of what science is about, ultimately to sell products rather than actually advance what we know about what's happening in the brain. Ed provides an implementation guide. Sometimes they name directly the vendors that they want states to use. Sometimes you kind of need to dig through to reconstruct, where they're channeling you. But folks who are active in literacy space talk about how the way this movement has evolved, it has this brought to you by the science of reading trademark kind of accompanying the changes that are happening. This has meant that the curricula that are identified as high quality are reaping enormous profits. One of them is Great Minds. They actually have no foundational skills component in the original curriculum, but they were designed by somebody who is affiliated or was affiliated with conservative think tanks, and they are a nonprofit that's just generating massive profits. Another nonprofit also was originally a failure, now is reporting millions of dollars in profits. And you kind of see very clearly they're being mandated. Of course, they're going to generate profits. They are no longer in competition. They no longer have to prove anything at all about what they are able to deliver. Amplify, and I mentioned they acquired the rights to District Court Language Arts that is being promoted as the curriculum candidate for being a national curriculum, which is an appalling and anti-constitutional concept in the United States, but that's a separate conversation. They also offer professional development. They offer screening tests. They have developed a Home Connect system that notifies parents that is also now in the bills as a requirement of districts having to do this. So they have been reporting how much their profits have grown. And again, they're connected to ALEC and with some of the other very powerful actors in the United States. And the last bit to watch out for in particular is the companies that are actually seeing schools not just as markets. And here you see Cambium analyzed market in 2017 and kind of submitted their analysis to the Consumer Bureau in the United States, saying that it's an $80.6 billion industry. And it's particularly digital sales that they were really investing in. And so Cambium has platforms that they're offering. They have assessments that districts have to purchase subscription rights for, but they also acquired Lexia that provides training that is now being mandated in over 20 states across the United States. And they brag about all the accomplishments that they've done, that they've not only grown their profits by 2021, and this was just the beginning of this wave, their profits grew 6 times, but they're also now calling themselves a literacy super brand, right? So massive privatization efforts. And you know, in their annual reports, they describe how they're now serving most of US districts, but they're also reaching internationally, right? So 170 countries that they've managed to push their products to. And science of reading is key to making sure that they're able to do this. The final company that I mentioned is Renaissance Learning. They also attend Excel summits, and they talk about a platform that integrates, right? So you have instructional materials, you have assessment, you also have the guide for teachers for how to differentiate things. And, you know, they're also talking about ways in which they are now represented in over 100 countries. And you can see in the corner how they reference the science, but also talk about, oh yeah, by the way, look at all the assessments and all the products that we have that are aligned with the science. From teachers' perspective, what's happening is troubling. And I have to acknowledge, I would say they're not red on that map, maybe for now, but maybe the map might not be updated, but who knows? But for teachers who are aware and who are paying attention to the massive amounts of changing, they're finding those changes troubling. And what they're saying is that we now have students who have to spend at least an hour a day on reading on their computer, or at least an hour a day on math on their computer. And, you know, there's now conflicting messages, right? Because on the one hand, there is a ban on digital devices and not allowing students to use cell phones, but at the same time, you know, kids are plugged into these platforms and are told to do pretty mindless exercises because districts purchased subscription rights to make sure that they are in compliance with the science of reading laws. And certainly what you know, this particular teacher shared with me is that this is not real reading, this is not real learning. So I'll close that, you know, the talk is about neuroscience, but really that disguises a lot of other agendas, and they are about private profits, but they're also about conservative causes and conservative social change. And what allows these reforms to spread is durable policy networks. Atlas has been around for at least 40 years. They've been influential in the ways in which climate change is not being addressed, but they're now also being influential in what is happening in education. I will close. This is what I share with teachers here when I speak to them. My message is can be quite disheartening because I share about powerful groups who receive a lot of funding, but I think we all in education need to remember that there are many more of us than of them. And so in that regard, if you think about how to respond, thinking about generative, not just oppositional messages is really important, but also thinking about how to articulate this message in simple language to yes, disobedient teachers is a perfect way of describing this, but sharing this message, building networks and coalitions, really investing in understanding what can be done to influence policy, public policy, coordinating activities, use social media to amplify the message of what's happening, and how students might be negatively affected, right? Because the effectiveness of these organizations, they know how to control the narrative. And they're amazing about having a very streamlined narrative that everybody repeats, and it creates the sense of consensus when it really is not consensus. It's just very formulaic language that is being used. And then finally, the important thing is to kind of remember that it's important to focus not just on the short game, but also on the long game. Pondicio's statement that, these groups have been fighting for this change for 20 years, it certainly is true. And unfortunately, what I see very often happen with activist teachers is that they are fighting for something, they win that cause, and they kind of dissipate, and staying consistent and continually defending public education and continually defending the kind of education that allows our students to flourish and really know how to engage with each other on a deep level. Is central to democracy, and we need to kind of keep on at it. I'll stop here. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Feel free to email me if you'd like. My work is available, and if you want to share any of your experiences, I'd be happy to hear from you. Yes, exactly. Germ has never gone away. It has been a movement for good 20 years, and it's only gaining new ways to disguise itself. And I think science of reading is certainly a way to help these agendas hide themselves behind the language of science.
Wow, Yelena, thank you. That's amazing. I think people can understand why I said when I watched you speak, it just blew my mind. But it's looking even more scary. But I thank you for tailoring to our context as well. I was particularly interested in when you said, despite all the talk about the brain, this actually isn't about the brain. But let's move into some questions. So we have got quite a few, so we'll see how far we get. Rebecca asks, this would have been partway through your presentation when you were talking about high quality. So Rebecca asks, who decides what is high quality?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because it was the groups connected to the conservative think tanks that started getting together. And I interviewed one who called them curriculum cabal. They had secret meetings, and it was them. They coined the phrase. The thing about the United States that is somewhat ironic, problematic, but the Common Core State Standards were originally pitched as this thing of raising quality and improving achievement. But then quickly it became clear that it was business interests and corporations and billionaires who were behind this. And there was opposition from the left and there was opposition from the right because this is a mandate, right? But these curriculum products were already created, and many of them were created by conservative think tanks. So then it was like, well, how do we rebrand this, right? And so the first rebranding happened around the time when that opposition started rising, and that's when the high quality instructional materials emerged. So we had the products, and then it was, we can't say that they're aligned with Common Core state standards. Well, what do we do, right? Like we have knowledge and arts, and we want to make sure that everybody uses it. Well, we're going to call them high quality.
That's just
Absolutely
marketing.
arbitrary.
Mm.
And then the next thing that happens is, oh, science of reading is a much more useful tool, right? Because you can't call science arbitrary because there are all these scientists who have these MRI scans and look at the brain light up. And you can't argue against that, can you? But it's still the same curricula.
Yeah, excellent. Um, and Jade asks, are you familiar with Professor Barbara Oakley's work? She's been quite influential here on our Ministry of Education.
Yeah.
But is
No,
that
I'm sorry.
not familiar? No, that's all right. We'll move on.
And so that we should give everybody the opportunity to have access to the same knowledge. But what gets left out is, but is there an opportunity to thrive, right? If we have societies where we are eliminating safety nets, we are eliminating access to basic needs, right? Children in the United States, Trump administration canceled most of the lunch programs, right? Like things that kids in poverty needed to survive are now being eliminated, but the grants for reading programs were placed back in because that's what the corporate bodies are getting, right? Like you can see how this is a much bigger project of normalizing inequality and saying, but we taught them the facts. They should be just fine now, when really kids don't have access even to basic health care.
So interesting. So many similarities. Just one really, we're going to just go up maybe just after the hour, if that's okay. We
Fine.
won't hold you too long. One last question was there was a question about are there any particular assessments that are attached to these movements? And I think I've heard you mentioned Dibbles, and I've heard you mention the phonics check, which maybe came out of Nick Gove in the UK.
Phonics Check came out of the UK, so that's its own story.
Yeah.
But several of the slides had companies with their products. And the interesting thing about assessments, Ames Web that Pearson produces is another one. That's actually one of the most common ones. So Pearson has gotten a lot of controversy about being the big business that is taking advantage of children. So they kind of tried to step away from K-12 curriculum market, or at least the way that's how it appears. They're trying to rebrand themselves, but they're using the assessment, right? And that's actually quite a few states require Ames Web as an assessment that every single school has to use so that the state has centralized data on all the schools in the state, and they can compare and rank schools and all sorts of things like that. So there is much more diversity with assessments, but there is still identifiable pockets of vendors that are being pushed as a part of this movement.
Mm. Thank you. I mean, this has just been amazing. And to use your theatre analogy, or to steal it, if you don't mind, I think you've just helped us to really pull open that stage curtain and look backstage, peer behind the scenery, examine the choreography and the stage management, and even the slick ticket sales and marketing department in particular, probably. So important to inform our understandings with a global perspective. Especially at this current time when our profession is losing autonomy and agency at pace, which is another familiar term, at pace. And it's a time when solutions to address equity in education have taken a very different turn, when curriculum design has largely been taken away from us, and when the honouring of Indigenous rights and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, our founding document, have been pushed to the back of the queue. So I'd like to conclude with this whakatauki. Thank you again for your time, your expertise, and for staying up late for us. I think so. Whakatauki is a Māori proverb, and I think this one is particularly relevant as we ponder the place or the potential disappearance of the concepts of learner understanding and of educator wisdom, and of the well-being of all. Mā te rongo ka mohio, mā te mohio ka marama, mā te marama ka mātou, mā te mātou ka ora. From listening comes knowledge, from knowledge comes understanding, from understanding comes wisdom, and from wisdom comes well-being. Thank you very much. Kia ora. Thank you everybody for joining us. Pō
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. And again, I'm so sorry for all the tech issues, but I'm glad the presentation went through.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to reading all the chat.
Me too. Thank you.
I don't know, Mark, whether we can close everyone else down or we have to wait for everyone else to disappear. Perhaps we stop the recording, eh? And you're muted, by the way.
Yeah. Most people are slowly trickling out now, and I can stop the recording.